highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the vast empty plains. The hum of my 18-wheeler's engine was a familiar companion, a steady backdrop to the solitude of long-haul trucking. The CB radio crackled occasionally with static-laden voices, but tonight even that was eerily quiet. I was hauling a load of industrial equipment from Denver to Salt Lake City, a route I knew well. It was a clear night, the stars scattered across the sky like tiny pinpricks of light, but the moon was absent, leaving the landscape cloaked in shadows. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 2:47 a.m. Still a few hours until dawn. The road ahead seemed to blur into the darkness, and fatigue began to creep in. I shook my head, trying to ward off the drowsiness. The last thing I needed was to nod off behind the wheel. Deciding a break was in order, I scanned the roadside for a rest stop or even a wide shoulder to pull over. A flickering sign caught my attention up ahead, a truck stop called Eagle's Rest. It wasn't one I remembered from previous trips, but my tired mind rationalized that maybe I just overlooked it. Pulling into the lot, I noticed it was nearly deserted. A single gas pump stood under a dimly lit canopy, and a small diner with a neon open sign blinked erratically. The place had an old, weathered look, as though it had been forgotten by time. Still, it was a chance to stretch my legs and grab some coffee. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was just as odd. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled faintly of grease and stale coffee. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her face obscured by a mop of unkempt hair. She didn't look up as I entered. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Yeah, and maybe a slice of pie if you've got it," I replied, sliding into a booth near the window. From there, I could keep an eye on my truck. The waitress shuffled off, and I glanced around the diner. The decor was dated, red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and black and white photos on the walls. But something felt off. The photos were crooked, and the faces of the people in them seemed strangely blurred, as if the images had been smeared by an unseen hand. When the waitress returned with my coffee and pie, I asked, "Quiet night, huh?" She paused, her eyes darting to the window. "Always is," she muttered before walking away. Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but I shrugged it off. Small-town folks were often peculiar. I took a sip of the coffee. It was bitter but hot, and glanced outside. That's when I noticed something strange. My truck's headlights were on, illuminating the lot, but I hadn't left them on. A figure stood just beyond the beams of light, motionless and barely visible in the shadows. I froze, my pulse quickening. Who the hell was out there? Setting down my mug, I stood and moved closer to the window for a better look. The figure didn't move, but now I could make out more details. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed elongated. Its face, if it had one, was obscured by the darkness. The sound of the diner door opening startled me, and I whipped around to see the waitress staring at me. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to leave, now." Before I could respond, the lights in the diner flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate my surroundings. The waitress was gone. I bolted for the door, bursting outside into the cool night air. My truck still sat where I'd parked it, but the figure was gone. I climbed into the cab, locking the doors behind me, and started the engine. The rumble of the diesel was a comfort, but as I shifted into gear, the CB radio crackled to life. "You can't run," a voice whispered, low and guttural. It wasn't a voice I recognized, and it sent chills down my spine. Ignoring it, I pulled out of the lot and back onto the highway. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, and I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something, or someone, chasing me. The CB crackled again, but this time, it was only static. For the next hour, I drove without incident. The road was empty, the night still and silent. I began to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing, that fatigue was playing tricks on my mind. But then, in the distance, I saw headlights approaching. A pair of them, side by side, as though two vehicles were traveling together. As they got closer, I realized something was wrong. The headlights were too high off the ground, and they seemed to move in perfect unison. My stomach dropped as the realization hit me. They weren't vehicles, they were eyes. The massive figure from the truck stop was now on the road, running straight toward me. Its movements were unnatural, jerky yet impossibly fast. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as I struggled to control the truck. The figure didn't slow down. It collided with the front of the truck with a deafening crash, and the impact sent me sprawling against the steering wheel. Dazed, I looked up to see the windshield spider-webbed with cracks, but the figure was gone. Breathing heavily, I climbed out of the cab to inspect the damage. The front grille was mangled, and there were deep gouges in the metal, as though something with claws had raked across it. But there was no sign of the creature. A low growl echoed from the darkness, and I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the night. The creature stood a few yards away, its elongated limbs twitching. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was a featureless void, save for the glowing eyes that bore into me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. Scrambling back into the cab, I slammed the door and floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, and I sped down the highway, my heart racing. The CB radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't static. A chorus of voices, disjointed and echoing, filled the cab. They spoke in fragments, some pleading, others laughing maniacally. One phrase stood out among the cacophony: "You'll never escape." I tried turning off the radio, but it wouldn't stop. The voices grew louder, more frantic, and I could feel the pressure building in my head. It was as if they were inside my mind, clawing at my thoughts. Desperation took hold, and I grabbed the CB microphone, yelling, "Leave me alone!" The voices ceased instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. My hands trembled on the wheel as I continued driving, the highway stretching endlessly ahead. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. In the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of movement. Something darted across the road behind me, too fast to be human. I told myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew better. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to blur together as I pushed the truck to its limits. The headlights of the rest area finally appeared in the distance, a beacon of safety. Other trucks were parked there, their drivers likely asleep. I pulled in and parked as close to the building as possible. Exiting the cab, I felt the weight of exhaustion and fear pressing down on me. The other truckers were nowhere to be seen, but their vehicles provided a sense of security. I made my way to the restroom, splashing cold water on my face in an attempt to ground myself. When I returned to the truck, something was wrong. The door was ajar, and the interior light was on. My breath caught in my throat as I approached, flashlight in hand. The claw marks on the dashboard confirmed my worst fears. I wasn't alone. A shadow shifted in the sleeper cab, and I froze. The figure emerged slowly, its glowing eyes fixed on me. It didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to hum with malevolence. I backed away, my mind racing for an escape plan. Suddenly, the parking lot lights flickered, and the creature let out an ear-piercing shriek. It lunged at me, but I managed to dive out of the way, scrambling toward the rest area building. The creature pursued me, its movements unnaturally fast and jerky. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me. The fluorescent lights inside the building buzzed and flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could hear the creature outside, its claws scraping against the metal door. My heart raced as I searched for something, anything, to defend myself. A maintenance closet caught my eye, and I grabbed a heavy wrench. The noise outside stopped abruptly, and an uneasy silence fell. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. Cautiously, I peeked out the window. The parking lot was empty. My truck sat where I'd left it, the door still ajar. Gathering my courage, I stepped outside, wrench in hand. The air was eerily still, and the oppressive feeling of being watched had vanished. Climbing back into the cab, I found the claw marks and damage were gone. The interior was pristine, as if nothing had happened. On the passenger seat, however, lay a single black feather, its edges glistening with an otherworldly sheen. I didn't question it. Starting the engine, I drove away from the rest area, determined to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. The CB radio remained silent, and the highway stretched on, indifferent to my ordeal. By the time the sun rose, the events of the night felt like a distant nightmare, but the feather in my pocket was a grim reminder that some things defy explanation. I never took that route again, and I never stopped at another unfamiliar truck stop. The road holds many secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. The highway stretched endlessly into the night, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through barren plains under a sky filled with cold stars. My 18-wheeler rumbled steadily forward, the dashboard clock ticking past 11:30 p.m. This was my life as a long-haul trucker, solitude, late-night drives, and endless stretches of road. Most nights I welcomed the silence. Tonight, though, there was a strange unease in the air, like the road itself was holding its breath. I was hauling electronics, valuable cargo, and that always made me more cautious. Stories of highway thieves weren't just rumors. Drivers whispered about gangs who laid traps on isolated roads, targeting trucks like mine. I scanned the empty highway, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirrors. The CB radio crackled faintly with static, but no voices broke the monotony. About 30 miles from the nearest town, my headlights caught a glint of metal on the shoulder. As I approached, I saw an old sedan parked haphazardly, its hood open and steam rising into the chilly night air. Standing next to it was a man waving his arms frantically. His face was shadowed, but his posture screamed desperation. I slowed down, my instincts conflicted. Stopping in the middle of nowhere was risky, but leaving someone stranded felt wrong. As my truck rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of the car, I reached for the tire iron I kept under the seat. Better safe than sorry. The man jogged up to my window as I rolled it down a crack. He looked to be in his 40s, with a scruffy beard and eyes that darted nervously. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice tinged with panic. "My car overheated and my phone's dead. Can you give me a lift to the next gas station?" I hesitated, my grip tightening on the tire iron. Something about his demeanor didn't sit right with me. Before I could answer, he added, "Please, man, my wife's back there in the car. She's not feeling well." That caught my attention. I leaned forward slightly, peering past him. Sure enough, there was a figure in the passenger seat slumped against the window. Her face was obscured by shadows, but she wasn't moving. "All right," I said finally, "but just you. I don't have room for both of you." The man's expression faltered for a split second before he nodded. "Let me get her comfortable first. One sec." He jogged back to the car, and I watched him closely, my unease growing. That's when I noticed something strange. The woman in the car hadn't moved at all, not even a twitch. Her posture was unnaturally stiff, and the way her head was tilted against the window looked off. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but before I could act, the man returned, holding a crowbar. His pleasant demeanor was gone, replaced by a predatory grin. "Change of plans," he said, raising the weapon. "Out of the truck, now." Adrenaline surged through me. I slammed the truck into gear and stomped on the gas. The sudden lurch threw the man off balance, and he stumbled as I sped away. My heart hammered in my chest as I glanced in the rearview mirror. The man stood in the middle of the road, watching me with that unsettling grin. His car and the woman inside quickly disappeared into the darkness. I drove for several miles, my pulse gradually returning to normal. I told myself I'd narrowly escaped a robbery, maybe worse, but something still didn't add up. The woman in the car, she didn't look alive. Shaking off the thought, I focused on the road. The highway was eerily empty, and the sense of unease from earlier was now a full-blown knot in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, my headlights caught movement ahead. Two figures were standing on the shoulder, illuminated in the stark white beams. They looked like a couple, a man and a woman, holding hands. My first instinct was to speed past them, but as I drew closer, I realized they weren't trying to flag me down. They just stood there, motionless, staring at my truck. The woman wore a simple dress that fluttered in the faint breeze, and the man was dressed in a dark suit. Both of their faces were pale, almost unnaturally so. I slowed down slightly, unable to take my eyes off them. As my truck passed, the woman turned her head to look directly at me. Her eyes were dark pits, empty and void of life. A chill ran down my spine, and I pressed the accelerator, putting as much distance between me and them as possible. A mile down the road, I glanced in the mirror and froze. The couple was standing in the middle of the highway, far behind me but still visible. They hadn't been there a moment ago. The radio crackled to life suddenly, startling me. A low, static-filled voice murmured, "You should have stopped." I grabbed the CB mic and tried to respond, but all I got was more static. The voice repeated, "You should have stopped," before the radio went silent again. Panic set in. I kept driving, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The road twisted and turned, the trees on either side pressing closer. My headlights flickered briefly, plunging me into momentary darkness before stabilizing. That's when I saw them again. The couple was standing directly in the middle of the road, forcing me to slam on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, the trailer swaying dangerously. My heart pounded as I stared at them through the windshield. They were closer now, their faces more detailed. The man's eyes were milky white, and his mouth was twisted into a grimace. The woman's expression was blank, but her dark, hollow eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I threw the truck into reverse, but before I could move, the woman raised her hand and pointed toward the forest. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and filled me with dread. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The woman's lips moved, but no sound came out. The man stepped forward, his movements jerky and unnatural. I panicked, slamming the truck into gear and swerving around them. My tires barely gripped the road as I sped away, my eyes darting between the windshield and the mirrors. When I finally dared to look again, they were gone. I kept driving, my thoughts racing. Who were they? What did they want? My headlights illuminated a sign for a rest stop a few miles ahead, and I decided to pull in. I needed to collect myself. maybe call someone. The rest stop was deserted, the single street lamp casting long flickering shadows. I parked and locked the doors, leaning back in my seat to catch my breath. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the faint creak of the truck settling. Then I saw it. In the side mirror, 2 figures emerged from the tree line, walking slowly toward the truck. It was them, the couple. They moved in perfect unison, their pale faces glowing faintly in the dim light. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, starting the engine and flooring the gas. The truck roared to life, and I tore out of the rest stop, not daring to look back. My heart felt like it would explode as I barreled down the highway, the speedometer needle climbing higher and higher. The forest blurred past, and I prayed I'd left them behind. But deep down, I knew I hadn't. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. It was a woman's voice, soft and chilling. "You can't escape us." I shouted into the void, demanding to know what they wanted. The only response was laughter, low and echoing, filling the cab with an unnatural chill. The headlights flickered once more, and when they came back, the couple was standing in the middle of the road again. This time, I didn't stop. I gritted my teeth and braced for impact, but as the truck passed through them, there was nothing. No thud, no resistance. They had vanished. By the time I reached the next town, dawn was breaking. I pulled into a truck stop and parked, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. Inside, the diner was warm and bustling, a stark contrast to the nightmare I just endured. As I sipped my coffee, I overheard 2 older truckers talking at the counter. "That stretch of highway's cursed," one of them said. "People see things. A couple, they say. Husband and wife. Died in a crash years ago back when the road was new." "Yeah," the other agreed. "They say they're looking for revenge, or maybe they just want company." I didn't say a word. I just finished my coffee and left. The highway was a desolate ribbon of asphalt slicing through the dark wilderness. It was the kind of road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the void, flanked on either side by thick forests that whispered and sighed in the cold night air. I had driven this route countless times before, my 18-wheeler loaded with goods destined for far-flung places. Yet tonight, there was an eerie weight to the journey, a sense of foreboding that gnawed at the edges of my mind. The radio in the cab crackled with static, its once lively country tunes now an indistinct hum. I turned it off, opting for silence, though the absence of sound only heightened the oppressive atmosphere. My headlights carved a narrow path through the gloom, illuminating the barren road ahead. The clock on the dashboard glowed faintly, its hands creeping past midnight. This was the witching hour, the time when the veil between the living and the dead was said to thin. As I rounded a curve, something caught my eye, a figure walking along the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it might be a hitchhiker, a rare sight on this remote stretch of highway. Slowing the truck, I squinted through the windshield. The figure was an old man, dressed in a tattered trucker's jacket and a faded cap pulled low over his face. He trudged forward with an unnatural stiffness, his movements deliberate yet unnerving. My instincts screamed at me to keep driving, but curiosity got the better of me. Pulling over to the side of the road, I rolled down the window and leaned out. "Hey there, need a ride?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. The man stopped but didn't turn to face me. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. A chill crept down my spine. There was something off about him, something that made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, he began walking again, disappearing into the shadows ahead. Shaking off the unease, I decided to continue. Perhaps he was just a drifter, someone who preferred solitude to company. Still, I couldn't shake the image of his hunched figure and the strange, deliberate way he moved. I pressed the accelerator, eager to put distance between myself and the unsettling encounter. The forest on either side of the highway seemed to close in, the trees leaning over the road like silent sentinels. The wind picked up, rattling the branches and sending leaves skittering across the pavement. As I drove, the headlights caught fleeting glimpses of movement among the trees, shadows darting just out of sight. My grip on the wheel tightened, and I tried to focus on the road ahead. Then, I saw him again. The old man was standing in the middle of the highway, directly in the path of my truck. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the massive vehicle skidded to a halt. My heart pounded as I stared at him, illuminated by the harsh glow of the headlights. He hadn't moved an inch, his expression hidden beneath the brim of his cap. The air inside the cab felt heavy, suffocating. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, the beam cutting through the darkness. "What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, anger masking my fear. "You trying to get yourself killed?" The old man didn't respond. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing toward the forest. His finger trembled. and his lips moved soundlessly, as if he were speaking words I couldn't hear. The flashlight flickered, the beam dimming momentarily before stabilizing. When I looked back at him, he was gone. Panic surged through me as I swung the flashlight around, searching for any sign of him. The road was empty, the forest silent except for the rustling of leaves. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. My breath came in ragged gasps as I climbed back into the cab, locking the doors and gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. I drove on, the encounter replaying in my mind like a broken record. Who was he, and how had he disappeared so suddenly? Questions swirled in my head, but no answers came. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The oppressive feeling from earlier had intensified, a suffocating weight that made it hard to breathe. As I rounded another bend, the headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. There, parked on the shoulder, was an old, rusted semi-truck. Its cab was tilted at an unnatural angle, the trailer listing to one side as if it had been abandoned for decades. The paint was faded and peeling, the tires deflated and cracked, but what sent a shiver down my spine was the figure standing next to it. It was the old man. He stood motionless, his gaze fixed on me as I slowed the truck to a crawl. This time, there was no mistaking it, he wasn't alive. His skin was ashen, his eyes sunken and hollow. The air around him seemed to shimmer, distorting like heat waves rising from the asphalt. I slammed on the brakes again, the truck jerking to a stop. Before I could react, he began to move, walking toward my truck with the same deliberate stiffness as before. I threw the truck into reverse, my foot pressing hard on the accelerator. The engine roared as I backed away, but no matter how fast I moved, he kept pace, his figure growing larger in the headlights. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. The call connected, but all I heard was static. Desperation clawed at me as the old man reached the front of the truck, his hand pressing against the hood. The metal groaned under his touch, the headlights flickering wildly. And then he was gone. One moment, he was there, and the next, the road was empty. I sat frozen in the cab, my heart racing and my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The only sound was the hum of the engine and my own ragged breathing. Gathering what courage I had left, I drove forward, passing the rusted semi-truck without looking back. The road ahead seemed endless, the forest a dark abyss on either side. I needed to reach the next town, to find people, light, and safety. But deep down, I knew the old man wasn't finished with me. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as I continued. Shadows danced at the edges of my vision, and faint whispers echoed in the cab. I turned the radio back on, hoping the noise would drown out the oppressive silence, but it only played static. The dashboard clock flickered, the numbers distorting before settling on 3 a.m. Then the engine sputtered. The truck lurched forward before grinding to a halt, the headlights dimming until they were nothing more than faint glows. I cursed under my breath, grabbing the flashlight and stepping out into the cold night air. The forest loomed around me, the trees towering like ancient guardians. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I opened the hood, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the engine. Everything looked fine, but the truck refused to start. Frustration turned to fear as I heard footsteps behind me. Spinning around, I aimed the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. And then I saw him again. He stood at the edge of the forest, his figure barely visible in the darkness. This time his cap was gone, revealing a gaunt, skeletal face. His eyes glowed faintly, twin points of light that bored into me. He raised his hand again, pointing toward the forest. "Come," he rasped, his voice barely audible but unmistakable. I shook my head, stepping back toward the cab. "Stay away from me." But he didn't move. Instead, the forest seemed to come alive, the trees swaying and creaking as if reacting to his presence. Shadows pooled around him, spreading across the ground like ink. The air grew colder, my breath visible in the faint beam of the flashlight. With no other options, I climbed back into the cab and locked the doors, praying the truck would start. Turning the key, I was met with silence. The engine was dead, and so was my hope of escape. The old man began to approach, his figure growing larger with each step. Desperation clawed at me as I searched for anything I could use to defend myself. My hand closed around a wrench, and I gripped it tightly, ready to fight if necessary. But as the old man reached the truck, he stopped, his glowing eyes staring through the windshield. "You're one of us now," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo inside my head. Before I could react, the world around me dissolved into darkness. The forest, the truck, and the old man all disappeared, leaving me alone in an endless void. I screamed. the sound swallowed by the emptiness. When I awoke, I was sitting in the driver's seat, the engine humming and the headlights illuminating the road ahead. The clock on the dashboard read 6 a.m., and the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but as I reached for the gear shift, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a faded trucker's cap, its fabric worn and stained with age. And in the rearview mirror, I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows of the cab. I've never driven that route again. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that the old man is still with me, waiting for the day I'll join him on that cursed highway. The highway cut through the wilderness like a scar, bordered on either side by dense, shadowy forests. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy, leaving the road bathed in an eerie, muted glow. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the 18-wheeler's engine a monotonous drone that did little to keep me alert. It was a route I'd taken dozens of times, but tonight felt different, as if the air itself were heavier, pressing against my chest with an unseen weight. It was close to midnight, and the radio had gone silent, static occasionally crackling through the speakers. I'd turned it off hours ago, preferring the quiet over the unsettling noise. My cargo was perishable goods destined for a remote town, and I was running behind schedule. Still, something about the night urged me to slow down, to tread carefully on this stretch of road. The isolation felt oppressive, the kind of quiet that gets under your skin. Outside, the trees loomed like sentinels, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. The occasional rustle of leaves or the cry of a distant owl did little to soothe my unease. It was the kind of night that made you hyper-aware of every shadow, every flicker of movement at the edge of your vision. As I rounded a bend, my headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the highway. My heart lurched as I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest. The truck shuddered to a halt, mere feet from the figure. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stared, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure was a woman, her long white dress fluttering in the faint breeze. Her hair hung in damp strands around her face, which was pale and expressionless. She didn't move, didn't react to the massive truck that had nearly run her down. I honked the horn, the sound shattering the stillness of the night. She didn't flinch. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, my boots crunching against the gravel shoulder. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I called, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the silence. She didn't respond. As I approached, the flashlight beam danced across her figure. Her eyes were fixed on something in the distance, unblinking and glassy. "You shouldn't be here," she said suddenly, her voice low and hollow. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Turn back." Before I could respond, she turned and walked off the road, disappearing into the tree line as if swallowed by the forest. I stood there, my breath visible in the chilly night air, debating whether to follow her. Common sense won out, and I returned to the cab, locking the doors behind me. Something about her warning lingered, a gnawing unease that refused to fade. I continued down the highway, my grip on the wheel tighter than before. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a tunnel of asphalt flanked by towering trees. My mind replayed the encounter, trying to rationalize it. Maybe she was lost, or maybe I was just overtired and imagining things. But the memory of her eyes, vacant, almost lifeless, made it hard to dismiss. About 15 minutes later, the highway curved sharply, and I spotted flashing hazard lights in the distance. As I approached, I saw the wreckage of a car sprawled across the road. The vehicle was crumpled, its front end buried in a tree trunk. Smoke wafted from the engine, and the acrid smell of gasoline hung in the air. I pulled over, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911, reporting the accident. Then, grabbing my flashlight, I approached the wreck cautiously. "Hello, is anyone here?" I called out, scanning the area for signs of life. A man's voice answered, weak and desperate. "Help, over here." I followed the sound to the other side of the car, where a man lay pinned beneath a large branch. His face was pale, and blood oozed from a gash on his forehead. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Please, you have to get me out of here. She's coming." I froze. "Who's coming?" His gaze darted to the forest, and he began to shake. "The woman. She's not human. She'll take me. Please, don't let her take me." A chill ran down my spine. I glanced toward the trees, half expecting to see her emerge. The man's panic was infectious, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I've called for help. An ambulance is on its way. Just hold on." "No time," he rasped, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. "You have to leave me. Save yourself." Before I could respond, the air grew colder, and the forest seemed to grow darker. A low, guttural sound echoed through the trees, like a cross between a growl and a moan. My flashlight flickered, the beam struggling to cut through the encroaching gloom. The man's grip tightened. "She's here." I turned, and there she was, standing at the edge of the forest. Her white dress seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, and her eyes, those empty, lifeless eyes, were fixed on us. She raised a hand, pointing directly at the man. Panic surged through me, and I acted on instinct. I grabbed a tire iron from the back of the truck and stepped between her and the injured man. "Stay back," I shouted, though my voice betrayed my fear. She didn't move, but the growling grew louder, reverberating through the trees. The man behind me sobbed, his pleas for mercy growing incoherent. My flashlight failed completely, plunging us into darkness. The next few moments were a blur. The growling stopped, replaced by an unnatural silence. When I turned back, the man was gone. The branch that had pinned him lay undisturbed, but there was no sign of him, no blood trail, no footprints, nothing. I swung the flashlight beam wildly, searching for any trace of him. The woman was gone too, leaving me alone in the suffocating darkness. My heart raced as I stumbled back to the truck, my hands trembling as I started the engine. The headlights pierced the night, revealing an empty road ahead. I drove for miles without stopping, adrenaline keeping me alert. The forest eventually gave way to open fields, and the oppressive feeling began to lift. By the time I reached the next town, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. I pulled into a truck stop and parked, my hands still shaking as I gripped the wheel. I stepped inside the diner, desperate for coffee in the presence of other people. The waitress gave me a concerned look as she poured my cup. "Rough night?" "You have no idea," I muttered, my voice hoarse. I considered telling her what had happened, but stopped myself. Who would believe me? Instead, I sipped my coffee in silence, trying to shake the lingering fear. As I left the diner, I noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board by the door. It featured a picture of a woman in a white dress, her hair hanging in damp strands around her face. "Missing since 1998, the caption read. Below it was a warning. "If you see her, do not stop." My blood ran cold as I stared at the flyer. The woman's eyes, though lifeless in the photograph, seemed to bore into me. I crumpled the paper in my fist and walked back to the truck, determined to leave that cursed highway behind. But as I started the engine and pulled onto the road, a familiar chill crept into the cab. The radio crackled to life and a low, hollow voice whispered, "You can't escape." I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. She was sitting in the back seat, her empty eyes staring at me through the reflection. The truck veered as I slammed on the brakes, but when I turned around, the seat was empty. I've taken a different road ever since, avoiding that stretch of highway at all costs. But sometimes, late at night, I feel a presence in the cab, hear the faint rustle of fabric, and catch a glimpse of a pale figure in the mirror. And I know she's still with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. To this day, I wonder about the man in the wreck. Did she take him, as he feared? Or was he part of her story, another ghost bound to that cursed stretch of road? I'll never know, but the memory haunts me. And no matter where I drive, I can't shake the feeling that one day she'll come for me too. The night was black as coal, with only the headlights of my 18-wheeler cutting through the suffocating darkness. The highway stretched endlessly before me, flanked by dense woods on either side. I had been driving for hours, trying to make up for lost time after a breakdown earlier in the day. This particular stretch of road was desolate, a shortcut that most drivers avoided due to its isolation. But time was money, and I had deliveries to make. The radio crackled with static, a low hum that filled the cab. I fiddled with the dial, searching for a station, but all I found was the occasional burst of eerie static or garbled voices. With a sigh, I turned it off, leaving only the rumble of the engine and the occasional whistle of the wind to keep me company. About 20 minutes into the road, I noticed something peculiar. A faint flickering light danced among the trees on the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be a campfire, but as I drew closer, the light seemed to multiply, shifting and swaying in an unnatural rhythm. My hands tightened on the wheel as I slowed the truck, my curiosity battling with a growing sense of unease. As the truck rolled to a near stop, I realized the lights weren't from a fire at all. They were figures, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. Men and women, dressed in old-fashioned clothing, were moving in synchronized patterns, as though part of some ghostly dance. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their eyes were dark voids that seemed to swallow the dim light around them. I pulled the truck to the side of the road, unable to look away from the surreal sight. The dancers paid no attention to my arrival, their movements fluid and hypnotic. There was a strange, soundless rhythm to their dance, as if they were moving to music only they could hear. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the cab, the cold night air biting at my skin. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it seemed to have no effect on the glowing figures. They continued their dance, their ghostly forms shimmering like heat waves. I took a hesitant step forward, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. "Hello?" Voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" The dancers didn't respond. They moved in eerie unison, their feet never quite touching the ground. As I watched, one of them turned toward me, their face devoid of expression. The hollow sockets where their eyes should have been seemed to lock onto mine, and a chill ran down my spine. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to return to the truck and drive away. But something about the scene held me captive, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't shake. The figure that had turned toward me began to drift closer, its movements smooth and unnatural. I stumbled backward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Stay back!" I shouted, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if studying me. Then, without warning, it raised an arm and pointed toward the forest. The other dancers froze mid-movement, their heads snapping in my direction. My breath caught in my throat as they all began to drift toward me, their feet never touching the ground. Panic surged through me, and I turned and bolted back to the truck, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly in the darkness. I scrambled into the door and locking it behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled to start the engine, the key slipping in the ignition. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into gear, my foot slamming on the accelerator. As the truck sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The ghostly figures were still there, standing on the roadside, their dark eyes watching me. My heart raced as I tried to put as much distance between them and myself as possible, but the image of their hollow faces and hypnotic dance was burned into my mind. After a few miles, I began to feel a sense of relief. The highway stretched empty before me, and the glowing figures were nowhere to be seen. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it was a group of people playing a prank, or perhaps I was just overtired and hallucinating. But deep down, I knew there was nothing natural about what I'd witnessed. My thoughts were interrupted by a sudden jolt. The truck shuddered, and the engine sputtered before cutting out entirely. The headlights flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I cursed under my breath, my pulse quickening as I tried to restart the engine. It refused to turn over, the dashboard lights blinking weakly before going dark. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the cab, the silence of the night pressing in on me. I opened the hood and shone the beam of light over the engine, but nothing seemed out of place. Frustration mingled with fear as I slammed the hood shut, the echo reverberating through the... That's when I heard it, a faint, otherworldly melody. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, yet deeply unsettling. I turned toward the source of the sound and froze. The glowing figures had returned, their numbers multiplied. They lined the sides of the highway, their ghostly forms swaying to the ethereal music. My flashlight flickered as I swept the beam over them, their faces devoid of emotion. They began to move closer, their feet gliding over the ground as if carried by the wind. Panic surged through me as I backed toward the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. The melody grew louder, filling the air with its haunting refrain. The dancers' movements became more frantic, their ghostly forms twisting and turning in unnatural ways. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, my hands trembling as I reached for my phone. The screen glowed faintly, but there was no signal. The ghostly figures surrounded the truck, their dark eyes staring up at me through the windows. The melody seemed to seep into my mind, drowning out all rational thought. Desperate, I leaned on the horn, the blaring sound cutting through the eerie music. The figures flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, they began to press their hands against the windows, their ghostly forms distorting as if trying to seep through the glass. I screamed, slamming my fists against the dashboard. "Leave me alone!" The melody stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The ghostly figures froze, their hollow eyes fixed on me. Then, as one, they began to dissipate, their forms fading into the darkness like smoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. After what felt like an eternity, the truck's engine sputtered to life on its own, the headlights flickering back on. I didn't question it. I threw the truck into gear and sped down the highway, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop miles away, the neon lights a welcome sight. I parked the truck and stumbled into the diner, my legs shaking beneath me. The waitress gave me a concerned look as she poured me a cup of coffee. "You okay, Honorable? You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a nervous chuckle. I forced a weak smile, the warmth of the coffee cup steadying my trembling hands. Something like that. As I sat there, the events of the night replayed in my mind. The ghostly dancers, the haunting melody, the oppressive darkness, it all felt like a nightmare. But the scratches on the truck's windows and the faint echo of the melody in my ears told me it was all too real. I took a different route the next time I had to make that delivery, avoiding that cursed stretch of highway at all costs. But every now and then, when I'm driving late at night, I catch a glimpse of faint lights dancing among the trees. It was a cold, biting night when the crash happened. The headlights of my truck flickered ominously as I barreled down the desolate highway, the empty stretches of road barely lit by the occasional street lamp. The hum of the engine, which had always been a constant companion, now felt distant, as if the truck had become an eerie, sentient thing of its own. I wasn't supposed to be on this route tonight. Something told me I should have pulled over for the night earlier, but work called. A delivery needed to be made, and the clock didn't care that I was on the verge of exhaustion. I'd taken this lonely stretch of road hundreds of times before. Route 43, the one that cut through the mountains, the one that always seemed to be shrouded in a mist no matter the weather. But tonight, something was different. The air felt heavier, as though it was thick with unspoken warnings. It was then that I saw it. A car, just ahead on the road, swerved into my lane. I had no time to react. My heart pounded as I swerved sharply to avoid it, but my truck's massive tires slid on the slick asphalt. The screeching sound of metal against metal filled the air. The world spun as the truck veered off the road and collided with something, though I never quite figured out what. Everything went black. I woke up to the sound of groaning metal, the truck listing awkwardly on its side. My head was spinning and my body ached like I'd been hit by a freight train. A dull throb pulsed in my temple, and my vision blurred as I tried to make sense of what had happened. The air smelled thick with gasoline, and the truck's engine was sputtering, struggling to stay alive. Shit, I muttered to myself, trying to push open the door, but it wouldn't budge. I forced my shoulder against it, wincing as the pain shot through my ribs, and finally the door creaked open, revealing the cold, empty night outside. I staggered out of the truck, my legs shaky and unsteady beneath me. My boots crunched against the gravel as I stood up, taking a deep breath of the freezing air. The world around me was eerily silent, save for the distant sound of the wind whistling through the trees. I turned to face the wreckage. The truck was mangled, but I was alive. The car that had swerved into my lane was nowhere to be seen. There were no skid marks, no broken glass, no sign of another vehicle having been involved. I shook my head in confusion. Had I imagined it? There was no way a car could just vanish like that. I took a few steps forward, trying to make sense of the scene, when I saw something. Two figures standing just beyond the wreckage. At first, I thought they were just shadows, maybe reflections of my mind playing tricks on me after the crash. But no, these weren't shadows. They were real. Two girls, both pale as ghosts, standing motionless by the side of the road. The first one was tall, with long, straight black hair that hung down past her shoulders. She wore a torn white dress that fluttered in the wind, her feet bare against the cold ground. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent. The second girl was smaller, her hair a tangled mess of blonde locks. She was dressed similarly, though her dress was a faded blue, and she held something in her hands, something I couldn't make out from the distance. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My first instinct was to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as though the air itself had frozen around me, locking me in place. "Are you all right?" I forced the words out, my voice shaking. Neither of them responded. The wind rustled through the trees, but the girls remained still, their vacant eyes staring right through me. A cold chill ran down my spine as I took a hesitant step forward. "Hello?" I called out again, louder this time. Still no response. It was like I wasn't even there. I reached into my jacket pocket for my phone, hoping to call for help, but when I pulled it out, the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on. I cursed under my breath, pocketing the useless device and taking another step toward the figures. Then, without warning, the smaller girl lifted her head. Her eyes were dark, black as coal, and as they locked onto mine, I felt a sudden wave of nausea. She smiled. No, grinned, but it wasn't a smile that conveyed warmth. It was an eerie, unsettling grin, one that twisted her features into something grotesque. "You're the one who hit us," she said, her voice barely a whisper, carried by the wind. The words sent a jolt through me. My mind raced as I tried to comprehend what she had just said. Hit us? What the hell was she talking about? I don't know what you mean, I stammered, my pulse quickening. There was a scar, but it wasn't here when I got out of the truck. There was nothing. I didn't hit anyone. The taller girl tilted her head, her long hair swaying in the breeze. "We were waiting for you," she said in a voice that was oddly calm, almost soothing, but there was a coldness to it that made my blood run cold. "And now we'll be with you forever." I stepped back, my heart racing. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered to myself. The smaller girl took a step toward me, and the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet. I stumbled, my vision blurring, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. She lifted her hand, pointing directly at me. "You shouldn't have survived," she said, her grin widening, her eyes dark and empty. "But you will. You will always remember us." Suddenly, the air around me grew colder. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a distant wail. The girls took another step closer, their footsteps silent on the gravel. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to cooperate. It was as if an invisible force was holding me in place. The taller girl took a step forward, her pale hand reaching toward me. "Don't be afraid," she said, her voice like a caress. "We're just here to show you the truth." Before I could react, the smaller girl spoke again, her voice a low, guttural whisper that sent chills down my spine. "We were the ones you hit." I felt my stomach twist as the words hit me like a punch to the gut. "The ones I hit?" Suddenly, the world around me seemed to shift. The air became thick with fog, and the road ahead faded into nothingness. The truck, the wreckage, everything seemed to vanish. I was no longer standing on Route 43. I was in a place that didn't make sense, a place where the road stretched into infinity, but the landscape was twisted and wrong. The trees were bent, their branches gnarled like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The sky itself was dark, swirling with storm clouds that blocked out the star. And then I saw it, the wreckage. My truck, lying on its side, crushed beyond recognition. But there was something else, 2 cars, not one. Both had been involved in the crash. But the car that had swerved into my lane, the one I had never found, was now visible, lying twisted on the side of the road. And then I saw them again, the 2 girls standing next to the wreckage, their faces pale and lifeless. They had been in the car, the same car, the one that was now destroyed beyond recognition. "We were waiting for you," the taller girl said again, her voice echoing through the strange landscape. "And now you'll join us." Before I could respond, everything went dark. I woke up in my truck. The engine was still running, the headlights glaring into the night, but the road was empty. There were no cars, no sign of any wreck, just the stillness of the highway. I blinked, my heart racing. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? No, I could still feel the cold creeping into my bones, the weight of the girl's words lingering in the air. I reached for my phone. It was still dead, but as I turned to look back at the road, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A pair of headlights, flickering in the distance, and in the rearview mirror, the reflection of 2 pale figures standing silently. I was already pushing the limits of my shift when the highway stretched out before me, empty and desolate, like a black ribbon that never ended. I'd been driving for hours, crisscrossing the endless expanse of Route 58, a stretch of road that few people cared about or even knew existed. It was a road meant for the forgotten, just how I liked it. The sun had already set when I took the turn onto the dirt road that cut through the vast, desolate nothingness. I was headed to a small town for a delivery, nothing major, just a routine drop-off. But there was something about this stretch of road that always unsettled me. It wasn't just that it was in the middle of nowhere. It was the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick and heavy. There was no radio reception out here, no cell signal. The only sound I had was the hum of the truck's engine and the occasional creak of the suspension. The headlights cut through the inky blackness ahead, illuminating only a few feet of the road at a time. It was as if the night itself was trying to swallow everything up. I'd been down this road before, and each time I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, lurking in the shadows. The trees were dense here, thick and gnarly, their branches twisted like skeletal hands reaching out. The occasional flash of something in my peripheral vision would send a shiver up my spine. Was it just a trick of the light, or something else? Tonight, it felt worse than usual. I glanced down at the clock on the dashboard, 2:15 a.m. The truck's engine rumbled as I shifted gears, and my mind started to wander. I'd been driving for hours, my eyelids heavy with fatigue. The sound of the tires on the gravel road was almost hypnotic, and I had to fight the urge to close my eyes for just a second. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, a shadow in the distance, barely visible beneath the thick trees. I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But as I drew closer, I realized it was something else, something far more disturbing. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed my foot on the brake, the truck jerking as I swerved to avoid whatever it was. My heart skipped a beat as I skidded to a stop on the gravel shoulder, the tires kicking up dirt as I looked out the windshield. Nothing. I exhaled, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel, staring into the dark, waiting for the figure to reappear. But there was no sign of anyone or anything, just the empty road, stretching endlessly in both directions. I wasn't the superstitious type, but that wasn't the first time I'd seen something strange on this stretch of road. I couldn't help but wonder if it was the ghosts of the highway, drivers lost long ago, still wandering the path they'd once traveled. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. You're just tired. I sat there for a moment, staring into the darkness, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But something told me to drive forward. It was like an instinct, something pulling me into the unknown. So I hit the gas and eased back onto the road, my hands still slightly trembling. But the feeling didn't leave. It was like the very air had shifted, as if the night was holding its breath. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I couldn't help but glance nervously at the trees lining the road. I could almost feel the eyes upon me, even though I knew I was alone out here. A few miles later, I saw something else. A car parked on the side of the road. Its headlights were off and the engine was silent. It was an old sedan, dark and nondescript, but it looked out of place here in the middle of nowhere. I slowed down instinctively. My first thought was that the car had broken down, or maybe the driver needed help. But there was something odd about it. The car was too still, almost like it had been sitting there for hours, unmoving. No one was inside, and no one was in sight. I pulled up next to it, rolling down the window to call out. "Hey, you okay?" I shouted, but my voice echoed back to me in the silence. There was no answer. I glanced around, my eyes scanning the darkness. No sign of anyone walking down the road. No sign of any activity whatsoever. I shouldn't have stopped. I knew that. But something about the car made me uneasy, like it was waiting for me to do something. I backed away slowly, my foot hovering over the gas pedal. As I turned my head to look forward, I saw it, something dark in the distance, the headlights of another vehicle. But this time, they weren't coming from behind me. They were coming from the opposite direction. I froze. The car was moving slowly, like it was pacing me, but it was far enough down the road that I could barely make out the shape. My pulse quickened. There shouldn't be anyone out here at this hour. No one ever came down this stretch of road. I wasn't sure what I was more afraid of, the car that shouldn't have been there or the feeling of being watched by something in the darkness. As the car drew closer, I could see it more clearly. It was an old beat-up truck similar to mine, but it was rusty and covered in grime. The headlights illuminated the front of my truck, and the vehicle slowed down as it passed me, its tires crunching the gravel in a slow, deliberate pattern. But when the truck passed, I didn't see the driver. Nothing but empty seats, no one inside. My heart skipped a beat. I slammed my foot on the accelerator, spinning the wheel to put distance between me and whatever was out there. The truck was now behind me, its headlights fading in the rearview mirror. But the sense of unease didn't leave. I pushed the truck harder, praying to reach the town. But as the road stretched on, I noticed something unsettling. The trees were starting to change. The trees had always been dense here, but now they seemed to crowd closer to the road, their twisted limbs clawing at the air, almost like they were closing in on me. The feeling of isolation, that quiet pressure in the back of my mind, was growing stronger by the second. And then it happened. A loud thud, a jolt from behind, as if something had struck the rear of my truck. I gasped, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I veered to the side of the road. I stopped, heart pounding, and checked the rearview mirror. Nothing. I opened the door, stepping out onto the gravel. The night air bit into my skin, and I could hear nothing but the sound of my breath and the crunch of the gravel beneath my boots. Then, I heard it. A faint sound, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I spun around, my heart in my throat. My eyes scanned the road and the trees, but all I could see was the thick darkness, the kind that swallowed up everything. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the trees. Tall, lanky, its face obscured by a dark hood. Its hands were raised in front of it, almost as if it was beckoning me forward. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. The figure didn't respond. I took a step forward, my feet moving on their own, and the air grew colder around me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I walked closer to the figure. But when I looked up, it was gone. The road was empty again. I stood frozen on the shoulder of the road, my heart hammering in my chest, the wind biting into my skin as I scanned the trees around me. The shadow I'd seen, tall, lanky, and hooded, was gone, just like that. It hadn't moved, it hadn't made a sound, yet it was there just for a moment. a fleeting presence that left a mark in the pit of my stomach. I stepped back toward the truck, my legs shaky as if the earth had started to shift beneath me. The sound of my boots crunching on the gravel was the only thing that kept me grounded. I reached for the door handle, but then I heard something, a faint whisper, so low that I could barely make out the words. "Help." I froze again, my hands still on the door. It came from the direction of the trees. The voice sounded weak, desperate, as though someone was trapped out there calling for help. My instinct screamed at me to get back in the truck and drive away, but something held me in place. I turned slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. There was nothing but the silent trees, the road, and the vast, empty stretch of land that seemed to stretch on forever. No one was there. The whispering had stopped. Maybe I had imagined it. After all, I hadn't slept much in the past few days. But then I saw movement. A figure, half hidden in the dark, stepping out from behind a tree. My breath hitched as I took in the shape of a person. A woman, her figure cloaked in tattered, dirty clothes, her long hair wild and unkempt. Her face was pale, as if she hadn't seen the light of day in years. "Are you all right?" My voice came out hoarse, shaky with fear, but I couldn't stop myself from asking. The woman didn't answer, but her eyes locked onto mine. They were empty, hollow, dark circles that seemed to peer into my very soul. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes never leaving hers. What am I doing, I thought. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Suddenly, the woman moved. She didn't walk, she glided, like a shadow on the wind, closing the gap between us too quickly for my mind to comprehend. I staggered backward, my mind reeling in panic, but the woman didn't stop. She reached out, her hand brushing against my arm like ice. I stumbled away, my heart racing as I spun toward the truck. I had to get out of there. But just as I slammed the truck door shut and started the engine, the headlights flickered. The shadows that had been thick around the trees seemed to stretch even further, enveloping the road in a dark, oppressive cloud. The woman, no, the thing that looked like a woman, was gone. I couldn't see her anywhere. I couldn't hear her footstep. I shifted the truck into gear, my hands clammy against the steering wheel as I drove off, my foot heavy on the accelerator. The headlights cut through the darkness, but the trees seemed to close in on me, like they were trying to swallow the road whole. Every mile I drove felt like it took me deeper into the heart of nowhere, where time and space no longer seemed to exist. As I drove, the unease didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and I found myself glancing nervously in the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see something or someone following me. The road stretched on, endless, with no sign of civilization. No signs for miles, no lights, just the sound of my truck cutting through the quiet, the tires humming on the asphalt, the only proof I was still in the world of the living. I had to be imagining things. The figure in the woods, the whispering voice, none of it made sense. My mind was playing tricks on me, no doubt, from exhaustion. But then, I saw it again. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flash of movement. Something or someone darted across the road in front of me, too quick for me to register properly. I slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt, the tires kicking up gravel as I came to a stop. I was alone. Nothing was there, no animals, no shadows, just the same empty road. My pulse was erratic, my breathing shallow. I sat there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I was losing it. This was all in my head, but I wasn't alone. A soft tapping on the window jolted me out of my thoughts. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I didn't dare look. I couldn't. I had to be imagining it, right? But then came the voice, soft, gentle, almost a whisper. "Help me." I turned slowly, my hand shaking as I reached for the door handle. And that's when I saw her again, the same woman, standing right outside the driver's side window, her face pressed up against the glass, her hollow eyes staring directly into mine. I couldn't move. My mind screamed at me to start the truck and drive, but my body refused to listen. I was paralyzed. Her lips parted, and she spoke again, her voice a rasping whisper that cut through the air like a knife. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, without warning, she vanished. 1 second she was there, and the next she was gone, just like that. I stared at the spot where she had been, trying to process what had just happened. Was she real? Was this all just some hallucination brought on by too many hours on the road? But then I saw it. The trees, now in full view of my headlights, were no longer empty. There were more figures, watching me from the shadows. I couldn't breathe. I wasn't alone out here. The figures were closer now, emerging from the woods, moving slowly toward the truck. They were all women, their faces hidden behind dark hoods or matted hair, their bodies wrapped in ragged clothing. They didn't speak. They didn't move like normal people. They glided, floating just above the ground as if they weren't fully part of this world. I started the engine, my foot slamming down on the gas pedal as I spun the wheel to get away from them. The truck roared to life, the headlights piercing the darkness, but no matter how fast I drove, they seemed to follow, just on the edge of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something, into some cursed place that didn't belong to the living. The women, the figures, they were coming for me. I had to get out of here, but the road was still endless. The trees stretched on, the figures gliding just behind me, always just out of reach. And then, in the rearview mirror, I saw her again, the woman. Her face, pale and twisted, peering through the back window. Her eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was never going to escape.